Media Essential Workers, thank you for joining us on this Thursday, 7 o'clock. We're on at a special time because we've got a very special guest, someone I'm very excited to speak with. We've talked to her before on our radio show, Life, Love, and the Grind, and that is the incomparable, I guess, would be one of the words I would use, Tracy Baim. Also joining me, helping me co-host, because again, I don't want to get caught up in the forest and miss the trees, the nuances, is an author of a book that I'm very, very not only passionate about, but really enjoyed, which was a book on the Defender. We have Ethan, and correct me if I get this wrong, Ethan Michaeli, who's joining me. Perfect. Who's joining me as a co-host, because I kind of want to talk about, and what today's topic is about, is local media, independent media, and getting the message out for communities, empowering and voicing and just telling the stories of communities. It's something that there's mainstream media. I've used this example quite a few times. I'll say it again. With all the mainstream media out there, big money, corporate money, some of the big stories, like with the Laquan McDonald shooting, are covered by independent journalists. There's independent people who have certain passions to get stories and messages out and find the truth. I got to ask, Tracy, I'm guessing that you're all about empowering these local media outlets, because when we talked last time, we talked about the Chicago Independent Media Alliance and your work there. Tell us a little about this. I know you spoke about it before, but I think it's fundamentally important for people to know what it is that organization does.
Sure. The Chicago Reader started the Chicago Independent Media Alliance about a year and a half ago. We hired a young woman, Yasmin Dominguez, to basically reach out to as many independent media outlets as she could to find out. We surveyed them on their strengths and what they felt they could work on together, revenue projects, editorial projects. So there's 67 members now. We know there's over 100 independent outlets in the Chicago area. So our goal is to keep adding and surveying them for what their needs are. Some of them are very active. We did a big fundraising drive in May and June because of COVID that raised $104,000 from individual donors. 2/3 of that was split evenly among all the 43 of them that participated. And then we raised $60,000 from foundations who did a match. So some of the outlets, the top outlet, Rebellious, a feminist online magazine, raised over $10,000 with their match and everything. And others raised maybe $1,500 or $2,000. So it can be about revenue. It's also about skills building and networking and sharing perhaps editorial resources. The reason we need that is because some of these outlets are very, very small. Some are hurting desperately because of the media. The outlet I co-founded 35 years ago this week, Windy City Times, just yesterday did its last print edition. We hope to stay online live. I've got our last print issue in my hands here, last call. So everybody, Chicago Defender went online only last year. By the way, if we were at my office, three of Ethan's books are right behind my head on my office shelf. So next time we'll do it in my office. So it's just a different way of covering. It's not to certainly not to replace the mainstream. We just often have a different approach. We start from a different starting line. In the gay community, for example, we start from the point that gay is good, and that doesn't mean all gay people are good. So we cover the good and bad of the gay community. And in the 80s in particular, and even sometimes still today, the mainstream media has different biases. Sometimes that bias comes at the reporter level. Sometimes it's at the editor level. Sometimes it's at the headline writer level. And there's just inherent biases against certain communities. Pretty much all communities have to fight this battle. And I came up through the gay community.
So I'm going to ask this, and I apologize because I didn't introduce this lovely lady behind me, because the stories are really about the people.
I roll.
Stories are really about the people, right? I mean, it's about the community, which is fundamentally the people that make it up. And the reason I bring this up is because one of the things that you had mentioned, Tracy, was that your mom was an inspiration. And actually, when I spoke with Ethan, you had told me that you had profiled Tracy's mom in the book. I read it a few years ago, so refresh my memory. Tell the people who are listening more about Joy Darrow.
So the book is called The Defender, How the Legendary Black Newspaper Changed America. It's about the Chicago Defender newspaper that was founded by an African-American man, Robert Abbott, in 1905. Joy Darrow, Tracy Baim's mom, was the editor of the Chicago Defender. The year exactly escapes me, but it was in the 1980s.
Yeah, kind of the mid 70s to the early mid 80s. Yeah.
And she was really a transformational figure at the newspaper. I worked at the Defender in the from 1991 to 1996. So Joy was already gone from the paper at that time, but her legend lived on. The people that had worked with her all talked about her, not just for the influence that she had in kind of, I would say, broadening their palette in terms of things that they covered and ways that they covered things, but also just because she was a great person who they all loved. And they kept speaking about how much fun she was and how much fun she was to spend time with. And so when I set out to write the book, which is really a history of the paper going back to the very beginning, there was a list of people that I had to cover. Like, I must include folks. There were, of course, thousands and thousands of people who came through the doors of the Defender who worked there. But Joy Darrow was at the very top of the list of people who absolutely had to be included, who had to be a part of the narrative.
Well, and that's one of the things I was asking you about. A typical newsroom, for people who are or are not familiar, is filled with characters, people who are finding their passion, somewhat eclectic, somewhat eccentric. So to stand out amongst this crowd, you really got to have some energy about you. And Tracy, this energy may or may not have inspired you. Did it? And if so, how?
It absolutely did. And what's funny about the Chicago Defender is the very first place I had my byline published, and you can still find it in the 1973 archives. I was 10 years old, and I wrote a kids' consumer column about bikes and toys and everything. And I would go with my mother to Calumet City. I think it was Calumet City where the printing plant was at the time, and watch them do the paste up of the boards. So I came into journalism from multiple points. I love the writing and the photography and the editing and such, but I also love how the product gets made. And I went to Lane Tech High School on the Northwest Side during an era where I got to witness the whole transformation and geek out and participate in the transformation of newspapers. So they have these old hot lead linotype machines, which for hundreds of years really were the way newspapers were produced. And I had lead scars to prove it, because you had to put this big lead pipe-like thing in, go up to the back, and I was kind of short, so I was at risk of getting the lead splash back at me when you put this thing in. And then I also learned the handset pipe. And they got the first Mergenthaler typesetting machines when I was a sophomore. So I was able to learn all those things and mostly afford college, because I did typesetting on these Mergenthaler. They were like refrigerator-sized typesetting machines. But because they were so new, the older people in the industry didn't know how to run them. And I happened just in time, kind of like people now that are doing social media as careers, because the older folks didn't learn that in college. Well, I had the benefit of being on that first wave of change and really enjoyed that part of it too, so that I never burned out on any one aspect of journalism. Because if I ever got tired of writing, I could do delivery. I could take photos. I could develop the photos, layout, whatever it took to produce something that then people had in their hands at the time before the internet, and had a story. And I started doing a family newsletter when I was 10 years old. So I just love giving voice to people that don't have that opportunity to put stories out there.
So you did this, you went to the Defender, you accumulated scars, and I'm sure those won't be the first or last scars in a illustrious career of journalism. Tell me about some of the scars you basically accumulated in deciding that you were going to fight for something, you were going to put out a paper, you were going to serve a community. You're in a city that's got the Tribune, it's got the Sun-Times, it's got the Defender, it's got some voices, but you figured there was a need. I've always been told, don't enter something unless you think you can do better or different than what's already out there. What did you and your partners at the time feel that you could do with your paper?
So in 1984, when I graduated, I went to Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. So I'm from Chicago, but the 4 years of college I was away. And that was pretty pivotal time in a lot of movements, the feminist movement and the gay movement in particular. So when I came back to Chicago, I didn't know what I was going to do. I started jobs as a typesetter overnight at advertising firms. And my stepfather was a journalist at the Tribune, and my mother a journalist. At the time, she was phasing out pretty much of the Chicago Defender, but they both knew a lot of media people. And I did freelance a little bit for the Tribune, but my stepfather told me, there are no openly gay people here working. And in the whole national media world, there were only a handful of openly gay journalists working outside of gay and feminist press. One of them, Randy Schultz from San Francisco. So I knew from my professors and my own family that the road was limited. And I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to typeset. Luckily, I didn't, because that career would have ended in 3 years. So my mom heard about a job at Gay Life newspaper, which was a weekly newspaper that had been started in the mid-1970s by a man named Chuck Renslow. And so I interviewed there, and I knew how to run some of the equipment, and I was happy to work for the wages. And I was a part-timer and moved up to managing editor in about a year. But because Chuck Renslow had also been very involved in Democratic politics, and he owned a bathhouse, he owned bars, a lot of people in the community felt like he couldn't run objectively the newspaper of record for the gay community. I never had any problem with Chuck. I was literally 21 years old and happy to have a job. But there was enough of a critical mass of the community that felt like we needed an independent voice. So a little reluctantly, I joined with three men, Bob Bearden, Jeff McCourt, and Drew Badanish, and was the founding managing editor of Windy City Times in September of 1985. And the reason the gay press was needed, I still think it's needed now. It's just the internet has caused such a disruption in the media world that it's difficult to do it financially. But there's definitely a lot of news to cover. Unfortunately, a lot of the same stories: HIV/AIDS, violence, discrimination, murder of trans women of color. But back then, mainstream media, first of all, there was no internet. So gay press was a really critical tool to communicate what's going on: protests, obituaries, all sorts of, listing all the aldermanic phone numbers so people could call and lobby for gay rights. But the mainstream media was either ignoring us or vilifying us. They were blaming people with HIV for it was their fault. They were innocent victims of HIV, like Ryan White, who was a hemophiliac. And then there were the guilty victims, homosexual men, as they were referred to in even the New York Times until around 1990. So it was really bad. It was bad because we were all called pedophiles. People would march in the Pride Parade that were teachers with bags over their heads. People lost custody of their children, custody of their partners. Serial killers targeted the community. So, there was just a wrenching amount of news, good and bad, that needed to be covered in a way that was quote unquote objective. Meaning, we just started from the point that we're not judging you for being gay. We're judging for you for other reasons if you're doing something bad or doing something good.
Ethan, I'm going to actually ask you about this from your perspective, researching the Defender and some of the other papers that were coming up in the same time. This isn't unique, right? Like sometimes the mainstream media, again, has these biases, paints communities in certain light. Can you think of, it doesn't sound to me, as I hear this story, that it was the first time that this story has been told about certain communities kind of being marginalized in mainstream press.
No, I think first we want to talk about, we have this idea of the mainstream media. What we're really talking about are the media institutions that reach out to the largest numbers of people in society. They tend to be white owned if they have private owners, or corporate owned, kind of publicly owned even in some cases where they're corporate entities. So they have a very different orientation when it comes to how they connect with their readers, right?
Why is it more lucrative then to have these biases, or is it just what they understand, or what do you attribute that to then?
It's historically, it's a kind of model, right? It's like we go back to the beginning of the 20th century. That's when you have the newspaper technology that Tracy was talking about. That's when it kind of starts to kind of be available to people in the masses. In the 19th century, newspapers are more like academic journals are today, where they have very small readerships, they come out pretty infrequently, and they're designed for an elite audience. What happened is in the beginning of the 20th century, men like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer mastered the use of these machines to create hundreds of thousands of copies of a daily publication, which they could then send out to people. And the way that they made money was on the small side. They could charge for each paper, but the cost of the paper itself was really just a means to get it out, a kind of circulation method, right? Where they really made their money was on advertising, because you had hundreds of thousands of readers. You could go to an advertiser, someone selling a car, someone selling houses, someone selling a pancake mix, whatever, and you could say, like, I have the only way available, right? There's no other competition. There's no other kind of media institution that's reaching out to readers in this way. And that was the case for almost 100 years. And so newspapers were essentially printing money, right? When they had like these kinds of mass readers, all they had to do was again, if you're trying to sell something, you really have no alternative for a long time. And even when the broadcast media starts out, it doesn't have quite the same reach or the same efficacy, and the tools of how you connect with your particular buyer audience are not set for decades. So this, you have to kind of imagine that from the newspaper baron point of view, this was a very lucrative operation. Community media did not have the same access to money. They were really taking advantage of the technology. The technology had become democratized to the point where a man like Robert Abbott, who had no means, was living in a rented apartment when he started the Defender, and literally went without food or clothing for months at a time, or with very little clothing and not replacing his and not eating well for months at a time, while he was trying to support his newspaper. The Defender made its money through its subscribers. It never had the large mass circulation that was able to attract advertisers. And frankly, advertisers discriminated against the Defender because it was an African-American owned newspaper reaching out to an African-American audience. So it never got the kind of advertising support that it even deserved for its own numbers, but it never had the numbers to really attract the kind of advertising that a Tribune or a Sun-Times does.
And Tracy, I'm going to see if this parallels with what you guys created multiple years later. Were you guys the exception in community journalism? Were you printing money, or were you finding yourself also being discriminated?
Well, it's interesting. There's a couple ways to look at it. One is that in the 80s, no mainstream advertisers wanted to go near the gay community. And the other way to look at it is, I'm such a community journalist that anytime we did make money, I just hired somebody. But the papers I was associated with, so I left Windy City Times for a decade and did a paper called Outlines, which was not as good at business as Windy City Times was. In the 90s, Windy City Times, the era I did not own it, was rolling in the money. And unfortunately, there was a substance abuse problem with my co-founder, which is why I left. And it was allowed to just expand because of phone sex ads and because of pharmaceutical company ads. But that kind of peaked around the time I bought it. And I bought it back from my co-founder in 2000, and it's been in decline ever since. But mainstream media has seen the gay community through a different kind of stereotype, that it's young white men partying with lots of money, right? Single white men. And so for my entire career, I fought against that stereotype. There are poor gay people, there are rich gay people, there are transgender women, transgender men, non-binary. Like it's bad. Like it's very corporate now at Pride, especially because there's these employee resource groups for gay people. So I don't want to lose that support, and I don't want to say that there aren't wealthy gay people, but we want to say that we don't want to be stereotyped, just like Black press gets stereotyped that everybody's poor, so they don't want to advertise. So stereotypes are wrong no matter what they are, even when they prove to be a benefit to your community. So anytime I would go do a presentation at a corporation, employee research group or anything, I would say, stop marketing to the gay community as if we're all young white men. If you have two older lesbians with their grandkid or any other kind of marginalized people within the gay community, you actually will build far more loyalty and depth within our community, because you'll get it, that we are of all strata, all class, all geography. and we mimic the mainstream. And so every community, the Latino community, every community that has media fights against the stereotypes to deliver a true message and also to get the support from the advertising world.
You know, it's very interesting you say that. I'm actually the union vice president for a broadcasting union. And one of the things we always come across when we're talking with some of the Hispanic media outlets is what's known as the Hispanic discount, which is technically selling advertising for less, again, based sometimes on these stereotypes and then based sometimes on what the owners say, hey, maybe we can get away with in negotiation. How do you so you're a news person, you're also a business person at this point, trying to make sure that this entity is able to survive in this economic environment. How do you go about finding that balance? How do you go about advocating for supporting what you're doing and telling a good story and empowering, or even if not empowering, telling the story of a community?
Well, so Windy City Times just published our last print issue ever. So clearly and actually the gay press has been in great decline the last 5 years. We were one of, I think, only 11 weekly gay papers, there were 20 something weekly and biweekly gay papers left as of a few years ago. And there's, I think, fewer than 20 now. And so there is a business case to be had, but the problem is, if you have such a small community, and I would say the Jewish community probably is similarly numbered to the LGBTQ community in the country, it's just a diminishing return to perform and create specific targeted advertising through the publications and media outlets created by that community. So instead, they will put ads to reach the gay community on Bravo TV or on any mainstream TV show that might have gay people on it. And so we kind of leapfrogged over corporate support for community media directly to broadcast media that reaches a broader range of gay people because they're broader in what they do. So it's sad. It's a very sad state. And part of what we're trying to do with the Independent Media Alliance is to try to strengthen ourselves through other means, whether that's memberships or government contracts, because the government spends their marketing dollars in a very biased way. They go for the big corporate types as well. Or working on pushing foundations to expand their portfolio into the journalism space. For those who do not currently fund journalism, we try to make the case that if you cover social justice issues or the environment in your funding portfolio, you need the journalists watching that issue too. They're watching your money and they're watching your issue. So we've been trying to advocate for that for a couple of years now, and several foundations, including Ethan's, attended a forum we did last November, and we're hoping that MacArthur Foundation is going to host a follow-up to that in this November, where we talk about the success of the last year. We've brought in a few $100,000 of new kinds of money to those outlets, but we're talking now, that literally is a drop in the bucket. COVID has thrown all of us a huge curveball. The Reader went to biweekly after 49 years of being weekly. We didn't lay off anybody because we got PPP, but we're definitely facing down a huge potential difficult 2021. We're lucky it's our 50th anniversary. We're also fortunate we just got 501c3 designation for a charity to found. January 1st, it's going to launch, and the Chicago Reader will be sold to that charity for $1. We have to get rid of our PPP loan first. So the SBA controls a little bit of our destiny because they're very slow to forgive these PPP loans. But the goal is, as soon as the PPP loan is forgiven, we would turn over the name of the Chicago Reader to the nonprofit. So that also may help us. But I'm telling you, nobody knows the solution. Nobody knows the future, because media was already collapsing. And some mainstream media outlets used COVID as an excuse, because within 2 weeks, they were starting to do layoffs when nobody knew really what the impact was going to be. And iHeartRadio did some furloughs that have become permanent. Almost every outlet in probably the country, but certainly in the Chicago area, faced some layoffs. We haven't had to yet. We did other things. We cut the paper instead of the people, but we don't know what that next future will be until we see how the impact of COVID and the elections are.
Let me ask you this. Is the future of journalism in the not-for-profit sphere? Because I'm forgetting the name, but I was just reading the feeder column actually this morning that talked about some journalists who work for a publication or an outlet who have now explored going into the not-for-profit space again, because it's something I actually tell me, why is that kind of something that people are looking into?
Well, it's not the answer for everybody. And it isn't some big old solution out there. Because even the Salt Lake City Tribune, which was kind of the biggest transition from for-profit to nonprofit, it happened last year, people were like, wow, this is going to change the whole industry. I don't think so. I think it's going to be right for certain entities. And even at the Salt Lake City Tribune, they're coming across a problem because the prior ownership still has some board representation. And the editor just resigned from there in the last couple of weeks for the Salt Lake City Tribune because she felt that there was influence happening from the former owners through their board positions. So a nonprofit can work. I think for the reader, it was a good solution for the Oak Park. There's a series of Oak Park papers that converted a few months before us. Block Club has a relative nonprofit model and some others, but it isn't for everybody because some journalism is going to be this entrepreneurial spirit where, it's kind of why with Windy City Times, I'd just rather shut down the print than go through that process of nonprofit. Eventually I hope maybe Windy City Times might merge into the reader once it gets rid of all its debts, once it's free and clear, and I can turn it over for $1. The website, I might do that if the reader board wants it. Even the Chicago Tribune, it's a good example. Right now, they are suffering greatly by being run by a venture capital firm that has controlling interest. I'm not sure how the shares work in those big old corporations, but Alden Capital is slowly and really quickly this year destroying that very essence of what the Chicago Tribune has been. And it would be wonderful for someone to save it. It may not be that a nonprofit could work at that level, or a billionaire, right? That, like Jeff Bezos has saved one paper, but that's because it was in DC and it was the heart of the power that he wanted to influence. So there's no one track for the future, but I'm telling you, we know study after study that shows when a community media outlet dies in a rural area, in an important niche community within a big city, corruption reigns. And so we have to continue to make that case study to allow journalism flourish whichever path the publishers and media producers take.
Can I add something there, Raza?
I would love for you to add something because I was just going to come to you for perspective as well. Yeah.
So I'm primarily an author, but I also work, as Tracy mentioned, for the Golden Institute, which is a philanthropy in Chicago. Not one of the larger philanthropies like the MacArthur Foundation, but we do work with MacArthur and the other philanthropies. And before I got into book writing, I was also running a publication called The Residence Journal, which was a nonprofit publication written for and by public housing tenants in Chicago. And my job as the executive director of our nonprofit organization there was to fundraise for the organization. So I have a very close relationship with journalism and philanthropies. And there's this idea out there that that journalism outfits will convert to becoming nonprofits and will just draw from the enormous pile of money that is out there from foundations. When you look at the actual amount of dollars that philanthropies have to spend, and you compare it with, say, government, you see very quickly that philanthropies are a tiny, tiny, tiny sector and simply do not have the money, even if they wanted to really float American journalism. They also, philanthropies, they also are mostly obligated because they're supporting a lot of nonprofit organizations out there, grassroots community groups that are doing organizing, that are doing primary services for people, that are doing healthcare, that are doing a lot of stuff that is essential in communities. And so there's not a lot of extra money out there, particularly when the stock market goes down, because all of these philanthropies have their dollars invested in the stock market. So when the stock market goes down, they have less to give. They give on an average of a couple of years, like a 3-year kind of an average. So that means that they can sometimes give a little bit more, a little bit longer into a recession, but it also means that when we come back from an economic downturn, they have less to give for a little while. So the idea out there that philanthropy will step in and save American journalism It's not going to happen. Tracy really deserves an enormous amount of credit for not just taking on the task of saving the reader but also in kind of figuring this out as a model for the reader. The reader, she makes it look easy, but it's almost miraculous what she's been able to accomplish in terms of setting up this arrangement and creating a buzz among philanthropies. I mean, I move in this circle, so I know that she's excited a lot of philanthropies with that argument that she just mentioned, that we need journalism to be here because otherwise corruption takes over.
So we talked about the structure and the financial economic environment of what media institutions are going through, but that's not really what brought many of us, I don't think any of us, into this realm. It's the difference we can make. It's the spirit of the journalism. It's some of the stories we've covered and the impacts we've seen. Tracy, tell me some of the things that you were proud to be part of, proud to profile, proud of how your paper covered.
You know, that coming into journalism in 1984 in Chicago was so fascinating. I felt literally like I was plopped into a war zone, but in a country that didn't know it was at war. There were fewer than 100 diagnosed cases of HIV/AIDS when I started. And I don't know why. I just knew what was happening ahead of other people in Chicago. It might be because in part, I was getting gay media from other cities. We would exchange papers from New York and San Francisco and LA, and it hit the coast. HIV/AIDS hit the coast much faster than it hit Chicago. We had a lot we could learn ahead of the curve. And so I was immediately writing about some really hefty stories in a community. And I was covering and photographing and interviewing mostly men who were my age or slightly older than me. And the last stories of their lives, and taking the last photos that would be used. And I was also covering serial killers, like Larry Eiler had killed a prostitute named Danny Bridges. It was the last of a couple dozen young men he had been accused of killing, and they caught him in Chicago. I was covering, all sorts of tragedy, but also at the same time, what that tragedy caused was a community to come together. I didn't experience the 1970s gay community, but there was many, many divisions, especially among gender, the men and the women, and also on race, because of course Chicago is the most segregated city in the world. So of course the gay community was segregated. So when I came in, though, we were experienced this kind of community building, like out of that anger and out of the frustration at the loss and the federal government ignoring HIV/AIDS as it wreaked havoc within the gay community. We also saw a parallel movement for gay rights that was accelerated because of HIV/AIDS. It forced people out of the closet. It forced people to see how few rights they actually had. And that included lesbians who, there was a very prominent case out of Minnesota of a lesbian who lost custody of her partner after her partner was made a quadriplegic in a car accident. Because they had no legal rights, her partner was not able to visit her and care for her. And the family kept her away from her until the insurance money ran out. And then miraculously, she won her case. And that case really, people were like, oh my God, you mean a family could come in and do that? And then of course, with HIV/AIDS, people were dying and family would come in and take the home from the partner if they had no legal protections, or take the child or the dog. And it was, we knew that parallel to fighting for literal lives, we were also fighting for people to have the dignity of life if they were survivors. And so we knew we needed the rights. So the gay rights bill in Chicago in July 86, was really pushed harder than it had been in the prior decade because of HIV/AIDS. And there was a massive rally in Daly Center to say, we want to vote. We want to know where our people stand, our 50 aldermen. We want to vote, even if the vote loses. And I remember sitting in that city council that summer when it lost, and the community singing, "We Shall Overcome." We had a headline on the front page of the Chicago of Windy City Times that said, "We shall overcome." And it was such a powerful movement because within a couple of years, unfortunately, Mayor Harold Washington died in the meantime, but under Mayor Eugene Sawyer, the city's gay rights bill passed. And if you look at other movements, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, those movements took, in the case of civil rights, hundreds of years. Slavery took, 100 years to 100 formal years. to get rid of. Women's suffrage took us decades and decades. And because of those movements, the gay movement, when it hit its stride, was able to be successful much quicker. And I say that for three reasons. One is because we did have those prior movements that created actual victories in the courts and the court of public opinion. They also were a training ground for many gay rights activists out of the 1960s who worked on Operation Breadbasket, who went to the South to register voters. And they learned the tactics that they then put to use in the gay movement. And then finally, there were actual court victories that happened. Roe v. Wade is what led to the elimination of sodomy laws and created a right to privacy. The Loving v. Virginia anti-miscegenation law, that those laws barred interracial marriage. That case was cited in the marriage case at the Supreme Court for allowing same-sex marriage. So without those prior movements, the gay movement would have had nothing, no ground to stand on. And AIDS accelerated our movement, but it was also a movement that was accelerated by prior movements.
Wow. I just had to take a moment just to think about that. Ethan, is there anything you'd like to mention about that? I know you studied kind of similar things with how, for instance, I know your book talks about a little bit about migration and how the Chicago Defender played into that. It talked about, some of the issues that happened with lynching and how that was able to mobilize the community just because it was something everyone had dealt with. But now there was a means to get that message out there. It just seems like these are parallels that, again, when we are at our worst in terms of crises, we find a way to be unified or at least be together.
Well, I think the bigger conversation here is just giving a voice, right? Every single movement that you guys have talked about from every aspect is just about giving a voice and giving a story and making sure that story reaches anybody and everybody possible. I mean, I'm going to continue to say, wow, Tracy, you completely blew my mind with every single thing that you have laid down, from gay rights history to African-American history versus Roe v. Wade. I mean, we're still at a point of Roe v. Wade, right? It's going to go back into the Supreme Court. And these are the times when we're asking everybody to kind of go up and continue to vote. I don't necessarily know if we have gone anywhere or have changed anything so drastic. Yes, we do have rights. Yes, our children do not get taken away from us if we're in a civil union. There are a lot of privileges, I believe, that we have, but is it really dignified to consider those as privileges, or is it just basic human right at this point that we're living in and we're fighting for? So without having you guys at the forefront of this, I don't necessarily know who would be telling the story. So, and again, I'm completely blown away by the work that you guys do and bringing light to this. I have like shivers up and down my arms because I feel like this is the story that we want to tell on Media Essential Workers. This is what makes me proud at the end of the day, to make sure that people like you continue to work and people like you continue to produce such good content out there, so we hear firsthand, unbiased opinions. That's it.
I think it's really, Sarah, what you said was really powerful, and I think it's great that you guys are hosting this show, and it's part of the tradition that journalism institutions really do train people for different parts of the movement. The Defender for many years worked on the issue of integrating the armed forces, right? That was an essential issue that they had been working on since they were founded, really. And when they finally, they kind of finally had leverage only in 1948. Remember, the Defender was founded in 1905. There are already thoughts at the Defender among its owners and its principals that how to get African Americans to be able to serve in the military without restriction, right? How African Americans, the military is segregated at this point, but that also means that there are no African American officers. So the Defender is working with the local National Guard unit in Chicago to create a special unit that has African-American officers, right? By 1948, so like nearly a half century after beginning this effort, the Defender is able to use its influence to move the African-American voting population, which at that moment is a swing voter population going from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, right? They're then able to leverage that influence to be able to get Harry Truman to commit to integrating the armed forces, right? Right at that time that you have the birth is the birth of the civil rights movement, which is led to a large extent by African-American veterans of the military, right? One of the attorneys who's working on the, this is actually not in the book because I found out afterwards, from a student I teach a course at the Harris School of Public Policy, and a wonderful student of mine discovered that a columnist for the Defender named Audie Murray was also an attorney on numerous civil rights cases, including Brown versus Board of Education. And Audie Murray was a very important attorney working on GLBTQ civil rights cases as well, decades later. She was very early in advocating for trans rights when I don't know if anyone else was really even putting that on the table. So her coming through the Defender was not an accident. She was there because that was the location to work on these issues in this way if you were African American. I'm of course a white guy who came through the Defender. You know, when I was there, I there was a moment maybe when I imagined that I was the first white guy to be at the Defender. I wasn't even the 101st. There was a long tradition of white people working at the Defender and being educated by their time at the Defender. Getting, sure, we contributed, we offered whatever we could offer, but they educated us. The staff at the Defender taught me how to understand America. And they did that very generously and very patiently, I have to say, because there was a lot that I didn't know, and there were a lot of stereotypes that they had to dispel along the way. So these institutions operate very much as training grounds too, is really what I wanted to underscore.
Mm-hmm.
Tracy, tell us a little about what you have in your background right there.
I've got some of the early couple years covers of Windy City Times in our issue that's out today. It's free online and there's a PDF online, but it's also on the streets. We put dozens and dozens of covers of Windy City Times and some of the other gay publications we did over the years. We did a publication called Black Line for the community, and then also the Latino community. I'm not sure what that is.
Let's give it a second and see if it clears. Give it another shot.
Okay. So we did several other kinds of media over the years. You know, one of the folks that when people talk about community media and the bias that a community has is someone, Ida B. Wells, who had a Chicago connection. In fact, she's buried here. She covered lynching in a way that transformed the information world at the time. But she was seen as an activist because she didn't want her own community to be lynched. And so when I was coming up in the 80s and people said I was an activist journalist, I was like, yeah, look to Ida B. Wells. He was called that too. I'm not saying I would be able to follow in her footsteps. I don't think anybody in our country's history could follow in her footsteps, but she was somebody I looked to and to say, you know what? She wasn't afraid to be called whatever they wanted to call her. She knew who she was, and she was trying to tell the stories of her community that were being literally buried. The mainstream media was almost a cheerleader to lynchings and certainly didn't interrogate them. Most of the media either ignored them and certainly didn't. I mean, they ran photos of all these white people at these lynchings as if it was some, you know, Dancing with the Stars of the era. Like there was no interrogation of how horrible this was, how extrajudicial it was. And today we kind of see that with some media that don't question how people that are literally calling for the death of their own fellow citizens who are cheering on and raising money for somebody who murdered in Kenosha their fellow citizens. It's very similar. And I would rather be called an activist journalist than somebody who thinks that they can just stand on the sidelines as a country is destroyed, like probably a lot of media did in the buildup in Germany with Hitler. Like they just let it ride because, you know, we're supposed to be, you know, just covering the news instead of really interrogating these stories.
If you go back, you know, Ida B. Wells, Ida B. Wells comes to Chicago really for the 1893 World's Fair, right? And this is where she meets Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, the former abolitionist, friend of Abraham Lincoln's. He's still alive, vital at 75 years old. He's at the World's Fair training Ida B. Wells and a whole host of other African-American intellectuals, including Robert Abbott, the future founder of the Defender, who's there as a college student. Ida B. Wells, though, is kind of the star protege. And a little bit of, she challenges Frederick Douglass even, and publishes a booklet called The Reason Why the Colored Man is Not at the World's Columbian Exposition. Okay? Now this is a long title, and she published it basically at the time because with the title that they thought was appropriate because African Americans were being excluded from the World's Fair. Well, it took her months to raise the money to get this published, and she went to Great Britain for a while to do it. And in the interim, Frederick Douglass, with his force of personality, with his celebrity, had inserted himself with his elbows essentially into the World's Fair. And so the African-American presence was not minor at the World's Fair because of that. So the title of the booklet is maybe a little bit might throw you, but if you read it, and it's accessible, it's online. You just Google Ida B. Wells 1893 World's Fair, it'll come up. If you read it, it will read like a very modern piece of investigative journalism. As Tracy said, it's a look at lynching, it's a look at the causes of lynching, it's a look at the circumstances of lynching, when other publications are just saying like, well, authorities killed somebody in the South today, you know, probably totally justified. Ida B. Wells documented every part of the process, pointed out that there were economic motives in many cases to murder the African-American men, women, and children who were killed in this way. In many cases, if there was an accusation of sexual liaison between the African-American man and a white woman, Ida B. Wells investigated that and found that in many cases this was totally made up, and in a few cases there was a consensual relationship that was exposed, and that was something that outraged white people and caused the murder to happen. So she was very, very good at kind of documenting all of this, even to the point where in the course of her investigation, she was a known person in the South at this time. And at one point, and by the way, newspapers at that time, they weren't just, some of them in the North and in other parts of the country were skeptical of lynching in the sense that they didn't think that it was such a bad thing and justified it. Papers in the South abetted the lynching. They would say, there will be a lynching Thursday at 4 o'clock at this location. Don't be late. Right? So when one of these cases, Ida B. Wells found out about, found a newspaper that was saying that there was going to be a lynching, and the editor of the newspaper sent a veiled threat saying like, yeah, we're going to have this lynching on Thursday. Why don't you send Ida B. Wells to come down and cover it? Well, obviously, if she had come down, she would have been subject to being murdered herself. So what did Ida B. Wells do? She published the letter, put it in the booklet, right? So again, she's using the power of journalism in a way that a modern journalist would. If you read the Tribune's account of incidents that she covers, they come across today as biased. The reader, a white reader at the time, would have maybe been thrown by Ida B. Wells' coverage, but a modern reader looking back, and I do this all the time with my students, they're shocked a lot of the times because what they really see is that it's the advocates of the past who are writing in terms that we would describe as modern and appropriate today. And it's the mainstream of the past that comes across as horribly biased and racist and sexist and otherwise kind of vile.
Oh, I can give you examples in the 50s. Well, going back to 1925, when the first gay rights organization in the country was started in Illinois, there was coverage of arrest of the guy in the mainstream that was very biased. But especially in the 1950s, as there was a purge for government workers who were seen as security risks, the headlines all over the country, including in Chicago, were pervert nest, raided, and things like that. And in the 1960s in Chicago, the Tribune would list the names of people arrested in gay bar raids in the paper. Teacher, 29, Peter Miller. You know, they would do that in the 60s and even into the 70s and in early 1980s. It stopped mostly by the time I was started. There was only one or two more big bar raids that had happened in the 80s. But in the 60s and 70s, the joke was that as an election neared, the gay bars that had been mostly owned by the mafia kind of acquiesced to raids by the cops so that they could have headlines in the papers saying they were cleaning up vice. So gay people were targeted, gay men and women, and transgender people were targeted. Chicago didn't even get rid of its cross-dressing ban until the early 1970s. If women were caught out without 3 items of female identified clothing, or vice versa, men as well, they could be arrested, and were. So yeah, the times they change. And that's why I've never feared being called an activist journalist, because I knew eventually, I would hope anyway, that it would catch up, that those headlines of perverts in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Tribune 55 years ago would catch up to them as being the horrors.
I got to ask, we got about 10 minutes left. I got to ask, what is the future of journalism from the context that you've seen? We know the value of journalism in terms of the community-based journalism. Where do you see it going from here? Is moving from print to just an internet presence, is it just a natural progression of things? Is it something we're going to be seeing more? Is there any there's no devaluing to that, right? I mean, the Defender's done it for a year. What does it show in terms of readership? What does it show in terms of people still using it as a source?
I think the platform is neutral in terms of where people get it, but it's neutral, but only if it's resourced. So New York Times Online, tons of resources. Other media are going online because they don't have the resources they don't have the resources to support reporters. So I think every case is different. That progression to online shouldn't be the only holy grail, even though it seems like it's a good thing. We have the Reader, we print 56,000 copies of the paper every 2 weeks. I get calls on delivery day, all day and the next day. Where's the Reader now? Where's the Reader now? We have a lot of people who want that physical curated issue. I also worry about the history that we're losing in a print format that museums and archives have been storing for hundreds of years, and that Ethan uses and I use to a lesser extent. There's a curated version of what happened that day or that week or that month. When you go back and you look at that outlet, whether it's on microfilm or in print form, that is different than what the internet does. The internet has so much noise that I worry that people that are authors and other researchers 30 years from now are going to have a real hard time getting a handle if everything was online only. And I'll give you an example. An author named Rebecca Mackay, who had a Pulitzer Prize nominated book called The Great Believers. She researched Windy City Times archives at the Gerber Library from the mid 1980s when we started for her book. And she also interviewed myself and some other people that lived through that era. But she said in the thank you notes in that book that the archives of Windy City Times were invaluable for her to get a sense of what that era was like. And I really worry that the internet is not going to provide that same kind of thing. I know that archives and museums are trying to figure out, and actually, ironically, I just got an email today from the Smithsonian asking for permission to archive my ChicagoGayHistory.org website. And I emailed back and I said, not until this administration is changed, because I do not trust you with my gay archives in an administration that's fighting against gay rights in this country and around the world. I haven't heard back from them yet. But it is important.
Until November 2nd.
Yeah. But anyway, Ethan, I'm not sure. I don't want to step on the final minutes time for you.
No, the only thing I wanted to add to that was that you're absolutely right, Tracy, that the challenge is going to be to understand the newspapers, and that's already happening. I can already see with my students, I have to teach them how to read a newspaper. Remember, the architecture of a newspaper is important, right? You see the news in the front pages, you see the editorial and the columnists a couple pages into the publication. That architecture gives you signals to let you know the news is news. This is a different area doing a different thing with a different purpose. The same way when you look at the cartoons or the TV listings or whatever, you can kind of understand from the graphic display that this is doing a different job. That doesn't translate online, and online readers who are used to reading everything online, they're not necessarily used to understanding or even looking for those clues. So I have to really teach students how to do that. And to be honest, a lot of researchers have already lost the skill. You see a lot of authors that will cite a letter to the editor or a commentary the same way as if it's a news article, right? And they don't, they're kind of using this. They say, this serves my point, so I'll use that. But that's not a real understanding of the way the editors put the newspaper together or the way that the readers understood it. So we have to, as we're moving forward in history, it's important to kind of remember that these things worked in a certain kind of way, and the same way that we have to understand the dangers of the technology, that you can get burned by a hot piece of lead, is the same way that you also have to understand that these newspapers were put together with a certain presentation in mind.
Tracy, I'm just going to leave with giving you the opportunity. I know I saw one of your Facebook posts that there's an opportunity to help those who are going to be perhaps underemployed.
We're laying off our drivers and most of our staff at this point. So if people go to windycitytimes.com, right in the middle near the top, there's a donate button. You can buy the souvenir issue, have it mailed to you, and you can also donate. We're trying to give as many week severance as we can. Like I said, what we're trying to do is retire the debt of the paper, which is severance for the employees plus our final printer debt. And once we do that, we're going to be a little freer to either hand it over to the reader or just operate at a lower level. To keep the website going, it's going to be at least a couple thousand a month. But compared to our prior, that's very small to me. I've been basically subsidizing this paper for a very long time. I mortgaged my house. I have credit card debt. My goal is to try to stop that bleeding and at least sustain a website until we can figure out the next steps. COVID definitely accelerated this for us. It was likely the direction we were moving in anyway. So now we need to figure out what the post-COVID, hopefully this post-COVID world looks like. So for now, we're kind of just treading water, figuring out where we're going to be able to go in 2021.
Tracy, you and I kind of had a conversation over the boxes, the newspaper
dispensers,
the newspaper dispensers, right? We talked about maybe putting together some kind of a fundraiser around it where I would paint them and then you would post them somewhere and sell them for a value that would go directly back into the pockets of, the drivers or anybody else that's affected. So Tracy basically told me that we could do this with 5 of the boxes. And if those sell really well, then, we'll expand this out to the rest of them. So
most of our spots are either in those city combined boxes or stores, but we do have 26 or so boxes, freestanding boxes. Some of them are pretty grody at this point. And then
I'm rolling up my sleeves.
Yeah, the reader will buy some of them because the reader has a lot of old metal yellow boxes out there rusted. So we'll buy some of them at the reader, but we absolutely put aside a few as a fundraiser. I think it's a really fun idea. We've donated quite a few boxes over the years to little lending libraries. Black Lives Matter used some of our old boxes and fixed them up for food dispensaries. So we're really open to that idea. So let's do it.
Well, look forward to seeing this collaboration. And again, this is what this is all about, is getting journalists, getting people who support journalism to collaborate and talk and discuss. And we really appreciate both Ethan and Tracy for joining us today. Thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time and coming on. Thank you both for what you do.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thank you.